Hello, this is Paul Isaacs, and in this video I'm going to talk a bit about the differences between Asperger Syndrome and autism. It's through conversations with Donna Williams really, and also looking at her blog. She's got a link on her website and on her blog about the differences between Asperger's and autism fruit salads, where she dissects the differences and the issues that both people with Asperger's and autism face. As I've explained in other videos, I was severely autistic as a child. I was non-verbal. There were difficulties with both expressive and receptive language, but I've found through observations of my own and some self-reflecting on my part of my childhood that the differences are significant enough for me to differentiate autism and Asperger's, I suppose. When I was diagnosed in 2010, the diagnostician gave me a diagnosis of high functioning autism. I explained to him using the symptomatology in the sense that he went through Donna Williams' triad of impairments. Now that triad is a standard in terms of diagnosing someone with an ASD, and one of the differentiations in terms of diagnosis is speech delay, although to be fair I have met many people with a diagnosis of Asperger syndrome who did have speech delay in infancy. So what is the significant difference? Well, using Donna Williams' fruit salad analogy, I will try and give a personal perspective to those differences, and the people listening or watching can make up their mind. One of the differences in terms of agnosias that Donna explains is the Agnosia Simultagnosia, and that is basically an agnosia where you see things in pieces rather than wholes, hence why I've got these Erling lenses on. They've certainly helped with that aspect of my autism and the way in which I process information, which for me the most disabling aspect of my autism, and the bit of it which makes me, how can I put it, less receptive and expressive, is actually the visual problems that come with that. If you go into a room, for example, and you don't understand the space, the dynamics, the depth, what it is you're looking at, and that goes on to another agnosia, which is semantic agnosia, which is a problem with understanding the meaning of your surroundings. So, for example, when I was young, my mother noticed that on top of appearing to be deaf, I think the reasons for that were I didn't respond to my name, and another issue was I did appear to be blind. The way in which I used to interact with the world was a very kinesthetic way of getting meaning through another source, which would typically be your eyes, and what I was using was my hands, my mouth, my tongue, my feet, licking, tapping, sniffing, doing all different ways of interpretation. Usually when you go into a room, you would be able to gauge what the room is, maybe where it is, but I still have these significant problems even now. I just learned to mask the confusion, whereas when I was younger I used to be in some ways a bit freer. I used to actually do a lot of those behaviours, and my mum's got a memory of me when I was out in the back garden having this house on my head. Now it was literally a house. What it was a felt house with a sort of flimsy plastic or wooden frame, and I had it on the top of my head, and she was looking out the window rather perplexed at me having this house on top of my head, and I was walking around the garden with it on. My theory behind that is that there's two things going on there. As I mentioned, the Simultagnosia, the object blindness, and the Semantic Agnosia, the meaning blindness, were both coming into play there, and in a way sort of divulging from any negativity, which I certainly hope it's not coming across that way, but nevertheless it was just another way of me experiencing an object and a sensation, because I like the feeling of the felt on my head, and that is what I used to do. For example, when I used to be in art lessons, I used to like getting the paint on my hands, and used to just sort of scrape it up and down the paper, which would have made no difference if it was a piece of paper in front of me or just smearing it on the table. It would have made no difference. The other thing I used to do repeatedly when I was younger in classes in primary school, I think it was in year 3, I used to just mould endlessly bits of Play-Doh, different bits of, and you know with Play-Doh there's all different colours, and I think it was either in year 3 or year 2 I can remember, it's actually in my book which I wrote, my autobiography, where I talk about this litre bottle of water, and and what I'd done is I filled it up and it had pinbrick holes in it, and what I would do is I would just stare at the little spouts of water coming out endlessly. I could have done that all day. Of course the teacher did eventually have to give in and get me focused on work, but that was nevertheless some of the real sensory issues going on there, being totally transfixed and being very scared also. You know, if you don't have a lot of verbal skills, it can be very frustrating, because there was a lot going on inside my head, but I couldn't necessarily get it out in a typical way. I had problems with articulation. Donna mentions oral apraxia, and that certainly was an issue with me in terms of articulation and how I formed words. I used to make a lot of monosyllabic sounds, a lot of sounds that I suppose were easy to make, and that in turn I would repeat them because I like the sound of them, and I like the sound of my voice repeating them. So it was in a way almost therapeutic and rhythmic. But I did have significant problems well into my, goodness me, late infancy. I've read some of my reports when I went to CAMS, and one of the problems they noticed is that I had problems with articulation even then, and one of my sort of woolly diagnosis that then was developmentally underage, and they were noticing I was having typical autistic problems when I was about 12 years old. The other things she mentions is the interpretation of the world, or rather, in the case of someone with autism, it's almost like a world before meaning. And I read an article she'd done in 1997 about that, and that really hit home that is very much how I experience the world. She says people with Asperger's are very much about interpretation and meaning and wanting that, whereas with me it's very different. And just bringing up the language for a second, she says about meaning deafness as opposed to literal thinking with Asperger's. Again, that is an issue. That is one of the reasons why people thought I was unresponsive, deaf, and just simply not listening, because it appeared so. But what was actually happening is I wasn't processing. And when people used to give me long strands of information, I couldn't process it, so it felt like a load of jumbling, tumbling sounds being directed at me. Sometimes I wouldn't even get that far, and even now it poses an issue. But I tell people when I do speeches and training to be very clear, not necessarily in the semantics of language, but how it's worded, not because of the literal thinking, but how I will process it. So it's almost like the nuts and bolts are different. And with my father, who's got Asperger's, he tends to have a semantic problem with language, a semantic pragmatic problem with language, where he's very literal. Where with me, it may appear that I have an overly literal way of perceiving words, but the problem actually is processing. And if you're only going to pick up certain amounts of words when someone's speaking to you, then you are going to make mistakes in interpretation. And that's certainly the case with me. I think also she touches on more cases of autoimmune problems. That certainly runs in my family. Eczema is one of them. Problems with the autoimmune system in general. My great-grandfather had dermatitis. There's even a history of more serious autoimmune issues such as cancer, in particular leukemia, on my dad's side, and also prostate cancer on my grand's side. So there's certainly some validity there in terms of not just the neurological aspect of autism, but also the other sort of aspects of autism which create the fruit salad. So to wrap that up, through a lot of self-reflection and thinking and researching, if this helps anyone, this video, who identifies herself as autistic rather than Asperger's, I hope it helps. Also, I'd like to say that Asperger's is a form of autism. I'm not trying to say that it's any less severe. I'm just clarifying some differences which I've noticed through Donna Williams' fruit salad analogy. And again, I hope this video helps. And please, if you're interested in looking at that blog, I will put it on a link underneath the video. Thank you very, very much for listening. Bye.